So we have first Margit, then we have Hoda, and then we have Kemi this morning, and then we will have a discussion.
So let me just start with a little bit of an explanation. This presentation is called Starting from the South, and it's an appeal to donors and big INGOs to start programming from the South. It's about a new way of imagining international CSO collaborations in the domain of advocacy. And I've been working on that for the past 2 to 3 years. Next, please, Ibrahim. So this is all because of our Dutch government having quite an extraordinary donor policy supporting civil society advocacy by southern and northern organizations in collaborations. It's unique for its big focus on advocacy, and it's also quite a large program. It was the previous program running right now, finishing this year, is 825 million euros. And we have a new program that's similar starting 2021. And that has 1.4 billion euros, all for civil society advocacy. So as a researcher, I and 7 other projects were invited to give input into the development of the policy for the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we were asked to look critically into basic starting points of the program, and we were funded by the independent science funding organization in the Netherlands. We were in India, that's where we did the research, and we were by and large an Indian team. So I put the names there. Next, please, Ibrahim. Yeah, so here's our team. We were 6. We had 6 postdoc researchers and 3 program leaders, and we were Wageningen University. That's where I'm based as a lead, and then 2 other universities, one in the United States, Lehigh University, and in Delhi, Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. So we picked an Indian team because of the sensitivity of the topic. Advocacy is a sensitive topic. Foreigners are easily, taken as suspicious, and also there are big access problems. So we had an Indian team because of that. And we had one main puzzle that led our research. Next, please, Ibrahim. So our research question was how to facilitate a greater leading role for Southern CSOs in advocacy collaboration. So while we were geared towards advising the North, so to say, we were looking to the South for that. Next, please. And we studied for that the way that civil society organizations in India gave shape to their advocacy roles. And I'll go into that a little bit further now, but just to explain, we studied 2 domains: disaster risk reduction, which is rather expertise-based and very closely collaborating with government, and then the rights of marginalized groups, which is more of an activist, rights-based nature. We did that for comparative purposes, and we had 3 researchers on each theme. Next, please. We have some outputs already available, some papers, policy brief, reports. So we have our own website for the projects. Here you find the address, and there you find already some publications that we have. So feel free to check that out. Next, please. So our big problem statement was, well, how do you address the dominance of northern actors in civil society collaborations? And we then focused on advocacy, but the topic and the problem is much broader than that. There are many structural problems limiting Southern leadership in these international collaborations. Funding relations really constrain Southern NGOs who depend on the Northern actors, that includes donors, as well as Northern and also Southern-based NGOs who are in control of funding, but also understandings and practices in collaborations that really are very much geared towards predefined results, controlling management, technicalities rather than facilitating Southern leadership. And we find that if you look at how this well understood problem has been addressed so far, it's very much in terms of funding questions, addressing the structural issue of funding, so gearing towards direct funding, more control over funding by Southern organizations, so distributed funding, for example, also the community philanthropy, local funding, going more for that, but also shaping governance of collaborations in a new way, resisting also trying to move around the dominance of Northern actors, but not so much. And the next place, Ibrahim, how to actually imagine collaboration in a new way, because I think that's really important to look at, because if you look at how the organizations in the Netherlands, for example, shape their role in advocacy, it's very much geared towards existing ways of thinking about it, thinking about what organizations' roles are, but also with the donors having fixed ideas of what a good program is and how you organize it. For example, even now, civil society organizations in the Netherlands, they have to apply with a kind of predefined program and then get approval from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then they start looking for their so-called partners. So that already predefines a lot of the possibilities and relations. So I really felt donors as well as Northern or INGOs, or at least powerful INGOs, need to find a way to reimagine collaboration. And to do that, we move towards India to see how Indian organizations actually see the way that international advocacy collaborations took shape and what kind of needs they have and what kind of role international collaborations can actually have in that. So very open research setup that really focused on organizations in India thinking and acting on the questions, what can we actually be, who matters to us in what way, and from what understanding of the reality in which we find ourselves. So like I said, some of our empirical findings on that are already available on our website. Next, please. And we're working on developing more papers. There are 2 papers now. One is in volunteers and the other is coming out soon in world development, but the rest will be coming, and there are reports already on the website next to that. So to study that, we looked at these questions from 3 angles: how organizations give shape to their role of representation, if any, how they give shape to collaboration with other CSOs, and how they envisage and act in state civil society relations, all in the context of doing advocacy. So it was a very ethnographic type of research, really trying to understand what organizations are doing and how they come to that by what kind of understanding of their situation and their possibilities. Next, please. So the main findings, and I'm being very brief on this because I want to focus on the recommendation, an important idea that came through in all of these studies was the contextualized agency. So organizations are really very much in a leading role, figuring out what to do, also coming to very diverse insights and understandings of how to move on certain understandings that they have. So you have roles really taking shape from that understanding of what they try to be, and very contextually, very dynamic, and a very big role also for being locally embedded and able to navigate and understand the context. So that understanding and possibility of acting upon that understanding shaped their role. And we also found that there was a relatively minor role for international actors, like the big NGOs that fund them and that see themselves as in the lead and see them as, for example, implementing partners. That's not at all how they conceive of their own roles. It's rather they want and have these INGOs as a supporting actor, at least ideally speaking. Next, please. So we really found that this can be an empirical ground. Of course, it's in line with, I think, what many of you already know, but it has never been really put on paper like that. If you know that organizations give shape to their role from their own understanding within their own context, and that's also necessary, so why don't you rethink what a good program actually is? So a good program in this view would be to start from the south. So accept that these southern CSOs have well-developed understandings on how to address them. And these understandings are embedded in their assessment of their own possibilities, in constraints, in their context, their own perspectives and capacities, and their relations with other more domestic CSOs and other actors rather than the international donor that tends to see itself as in the lead and really important. But we did find that the northern CSOs have a complementary role to play and are very much valued for different roles that they can play, and we identified those as well. However, because they see themselves in the lead, they also get in the way, but that's well established. So I'm not going into that now. Please, Ibrahim, next one. So what does that mean? It's really about turning programming upside down. So the programming that starts in the north, in the interaction between donors and northern-based INGOs most of the time, that would be turned around, where you really start looking at how are we really connecting what is already going on in the global south, thinking also in terms of networks, then in terms of aid chains, right, from the donor to the INGO to the southern partners, but really seeing your role as an INGO as a participant in a wider network that does not have you at the center of it. So really engaging with what's already going on and networks that already exist, rather than coming up with a new program every 4 or 5 years. Yes, Ibrahim, please. Next one. So the starting points then, reshape the starting points of collaboration, rather than having a coherent, rational, universally shaped multi-country program. You would be contributing as an INGO and as a northern-based donor on the basis of mutual recognition of identities and agendas and capacities. So you don't have a program where you look for a partner that fits in, but you see what are these people doing and how can I contribute to that? What is their agenda? What are their capacities? And what am I bringing in? So you have power too as an organizing principle, rather than empowering people by what you do. You see what people already can do and how you can strengthen that. So then you also explicitly recognize that good advocacy is context embedded, and you are able to do advocacy because you are so able to connect to what's going on politically and socially and economically in a society. Your understanding of that society is key there, and that's then recognized. So like I already said, change as an ongoing process you contribute to, rather than an intervention that is right because it's such a smart intervention. That's what how it's very much framed often in my view. Next, please, Ibrahim. So concrete principles would then be very simple in a way. So you make sure that you understand what are ongoing processes in a certain country where you want to work as an INGO or a donor. What are the civil society actions there? Who is working with whom towards what? What are organizations' agendas? And what are they trying to achieve there? What are their priorities? And what are their strengths already based in, and how can they act on that, and how can you contribute to that in a complementary role. So in the end, reimagining collaboration then for Northern INGOs and their donors is also about redefining your own role, which becomes more complementary. If you understand what the other is doing and you're acting and thinking based on that, then you don't lose your own identity, which is, well, what is often the fear, the marginalization of us over here. No, you have very important strengths, very important powers, and those are really complementary to what those people in the South are doing. So next, please, Ibrahim. So it's about rethinking roles, a contextually rooted program. Like I said, I don't need to repeat that. Contributions as complementary. And then I want to say a few things more about that complementary. Next, please, Ibrahim. Yeah, so complementary means then that you rethink your roles where you start with your own strengths see what you contribute to what's already going on. So connecting also with the things that you are actually appreciated for. So raising funds, mobilizing public opinion in the global north, the international dimensions of issues and processes, bringing those in, because that's often outside of the, the view of many southern CSOs, the technical expertise and the services you can provide, engaging northern institutions, convening and brokering. All these are things that northern INGOs can be very good at, and that would be very welcome also, looking at how these southern CSOs see your role, and also does not marginalize you. So this is really about rethinking roles rather than marginalizing the North. I think that's about it. Thank you very much. This is how far I've got. I'm trying to turn this into a paper. There's already an advisory report. I could say a few things more about that later, maybe. So if you have any ideas on how I could work this into a paper, any tips you have, I'd be happy to hear that. Of course, also any other feedback. Thank you.
Okay, so this is my presentation, and it's part of my PhD entitled NGO-Led Rural Development in Egypt. My supervisors are Steve Conley and Tom Goodfellow, so they're joining me on that. So I'll give you the structure of the presentation, and we'll go on forward from the next slide. So next slide, please, Abel. I'll tell you the story behind why I chose this topic, and rural development between the government and the NGOs, some preliminary findings between the program, the discourse, and then we'll leave you at the end with some questions. I hope I would have given you like what Margaret gave us, like some reflections on what to do next, but I'm still at the questions phase. So next slide, please. Yeah. So although like everybody knows the Egypt, which like, the pyramids and, the city and the Nile and all the beautiful scenery, unfortunately, 50% of the Egyptian population live in rural areas, and most of them live in poverty. And in 2012, I just finished my undergrad studies, and I was so enthusiastic to help the community. I joined the group of people. So next slide, please. So I joined with a group of people in a project called Building Lives, or Benibni Haya in Arabic. And the idea was to shift from helping the city and to go help the rural areas. And our plan was to do comprehensive development, was to do a utopian village, a utopian hamlet, covering all the aspects of life, including physical interventions, sewage, houses, roofs, doing also human development through awareness with kids, ladies and men, sports, and medical convoys. And we also did some handouts. And those were usually seasonal handouts, but they were also a kind of an icebreaker with the people. And what we saw was that, yes, we did some good things, but there were also some negatives. Yeah, perfect. So this takes me to why this research. We saw some drawbacks, and I, as a person, decided, okay, I'll pursue this and know what is really going on. And were we the first people to think about this? What did other people do before that? What is the process? Who are the actors? And the idea was that we need to understand, like, to know where the problem is and if what we were doing was good enough. We need to know, to understand the system and the process. There was also an obvious lack of literature about this type of NGO development in Egypt. And even the possible literature was all quantitative instead of qualitative. And the physical interventions will always prioritize. So they always do a house and count, like we did 10 houses, 20 houses. But nobody talked about the awareness, the schools, the education. And finally, which was the most important bit to me, was that the intended beneficiaries' perspectives was never highlighted. It's always the NGO or the government and so on. So next slide, please. So this is why I think that this research is important. First point is, the more countries we search, the more we understand more about the different ideas. Searching a country like Egypt or other middle income countries, we can understand different perspectives. Those countries, for example, in Egypt, the national NGOs play the major role instead of the international NGOs. And instead of doing this on their own, the NGOs are actually collaborating and are being managed by the government. So it's a different perspective and different take on how the NGOs are helping develop the country. And maybe it's difficult because there are some political constraints, the databases are not available, but again, we need to broaden all the research to different countries. So next slide, please. Start from how all of this started. So I needed to know, like, I started this in 2012, but what happened before? NGOs in Egypt generally started in the 1820s. And by the 1930s, with all small NGOs and CDOs and CSOs, the ministry decided to initiate the formation of some rural welfare centers with the idea of development from, like, local development for those hamlets. They continued all of those programs till the 1970s. And in the 1990s, they started the idea of social funding with all what was happening globally, communism and whatever. And then in 1993, they started a program called Shuruk Participation. And the idea was developing villages through participation. Unfortunately, it stopped. And there isn't research on why it really stopped. Maybe a change in government, a change in leaders. But then by 1997, the NGOs in Egypt started to get larger in number. And they started to really share with the government all the needs of the people. Next slide, please. Yeah. In 2007, the government decided, okay, we are going to tackle the problem of rural development through geographical targeting. And what they did was, with the World Bank, they ranked all the Egyptian villages from the poorest to the least poor. So it was all quantitative based. And they decided for phase 1 to tackle 150 villages. Unfortunately, there is only one research about why the poorest 1,000 villages program stopped and what was the issues with it. And they only highlighted that there were biases when choosing the villages. The governors did not want to portray their worst villages to the president. So they maybe chose one poor village and another semi-poor village, if you can call them that way. And after tackling, the idea was to go to one village and do a comprehensive development. But the problem was, if you just target a whole village, they're not all poor. Again, you have to target maybe families, or there might be another way of targeting that way. It also maybe stopped because in 2011, we had the revolution and a change in regime. So everything before that, nobody wanted to talk about anymore. 2012 is when I, with my group of friends, started, and actually other larger NGOs started maybe to copy the same idea. So we might call it isomorphism, which is the NGOs are copying from each other, or maybe just they started to see the NGOs, to see the rural areas more. By 2017, the government decided, okay, so the NGOs are already doing this. Why not let the NGOs help me in the development? So in 2017, the government started a program called Sakan Karim, which means a dignified house. And through the NGOs, so collaborating with the NGOs, the program was aimed to do houses, sewage, and water in poor villages. And in 2019, the presidency again decided through the NGOs to do another program called A Dignified Life, or Haya Karima. And it included houses, sewage, and water, but it also included other things like awareness. It did not really start now, but it has more than 16 NGOs in that program. And we need to know, like, how will they tackle all of these issues, or will it go back to only be houses and water? Today, we have more than 53,000 registered NGOs in Egypt. I mean, locally, we're not talking even about the international NGOs. And a lot of fund going through those people, through those NGOs. And this is why we need more research to just know where to put all of this funding. So next slide, please. Yeah, so what I'm going to show you in a brief next is like some preliminary findings from my case study. So I chose two of the two governorates, a little bit like poor governorates with two NGOs, a larger NGO and a smaller NGO. And the research was done through in-depth interviews with government officials, NGO managers, and the beneficiaries themselves. And if you can see in the pictures, you can see the house, like the room before and after the intervention of an NGO, and the house from the other side also before and after, just to give you a glimpse of what they are doing. So next slide, please. So the preliminary findings. Next again. Yeah, so the program is probably like what you can see in this diagram. Larger NGOs signing a protocol with the government, and maybe sometimes through local NGOs, CBOs or CDOs, and then this is how they contact the villages. But there are other smaller voluntary NGOs that are not connected to the government through the protocol and only use personal fundings, like individual funders, and they do literally the same. So they're doing the same. There is extreme isomorphism between what all the NGOs are doing, and the end result is the same, basically. You can see also on the side that is the funders and the donors are really affecting what those NGOs are doing. Next slide, please. From the findings, it was, I think, obvious to me that there is a main discourse of development. So even larger NGOs or smaller voluntarily NGOs are following the same discourse of development. They go to a village, target the families and the poorest villages. They do the houses, the roofs, and then if they can, they do awareness, but it's totally voluntary and they don't have to do it. But what was really interesting is to find another complementary discourse, the side of the beneficiaries. How do the beneficiaries see this type of development? We know how the NGOs see it. They are providing what the government wants to do through the NGOs. But what was really interesting is to just know more about the complementary discourse. Next slide, please. And what was really interesting, and here I only show some of the channels of help, whether the one on the left, which is the smaller NGO, which is only a very simple hierarchy between the volunteers and then the village representative and then the workers who do the house or the beneficiaries. What was really interesting is that you look on the right and you also see, like, in a very complex hierarchy, you have the NGO headquarters, local office and a field manager. But again, the last two steps are the same, village representative and the beneficiaries. So the idea is, the idea is somebody who is the village representative is showing to be very, very important. So whether it's a very simple hierarchy or it's a more complex hierarchy, there is this middleman. There is this, it might be a CDO manager, just a guy from the village, a teacher in the school. This local leader is playing a great role. And you can see that between this village representative and the volunteers, all the field manager, depending on the different hierarchies, there is only some lists. They're not even put in a database, not an Excel sheet, just a list written by hand. This lady or that man need or whatever, and they just update the lists. So there isn't a real database. But here I want to really talk about this village representative, especially with the topic of our panel. So next slide, please. Yeah. When exploring the readership, I think that this guy, which is usually a he, is really playing a huge role. He is the intermediate. He's usually, as I said, he's employed. So he has sufficient money, so he's not in need, and he's trustworthy to most of the people. Again, you might find biases, but that's the main thing. He might be serving only one hamlet or might be serving several hamlets, depending on the area he is in. So next slide, please. So what I took from the themes and analysis of my interviews was that the CDO director or the village manager, as you can see in the quotes, one of them, for example, said, as for us as representative, we work for God. We don't want any other reward. Our aim is to be the reason that whoever needs help gets it without anything in return. And you can see how, like, this is their main motive. It's a reward from God. And another one said, and helping people. Another one said, I founded this organization to help the poor. You will find that most of the CDO managers are all volunteers. So I would say that that is, yes, that's the main motive. But there would be second, we can call them even unintended motives or unintended consequences to being a village representative. Of course, there is the status and power. People go to him for help. They even go to him sometimes for disputes. There is also sometimes the financial benefit depending on what they work. So sometimes they own a shop for construction. So the NGO decides as a payback to just buy from them some stuff. Sometimes they themselves are working in construction. So, and of course, self-esteem, being the person everybody knows that he is going to solve the problem and he is going to bring the NGO to do you a house and so on. So next slide, please. And this is why there is also always two sides to each coin. And yes, this is why, like, there is a reward from God, but other motives as well. How the people perceive him also is different. So for the villagers, I quote here a lady who is one of the beneficiaries, and she was bragging, like saying a lot about this person. They are representatives of the people here. They know who is in need or in bad condition. So they have all the faith in that person. But that is only one of the quotes. Other people who did not get any help might say they're only giving their families, they do have biases and so on. However, from the NGO's perspectives, they see the guides as like, he is a guide. He sends us all the possible names of the deserving people, as I said, in a list, and we take the decision according to the NGO requirements and the survey. A survey, if they are deserving, then great. If they are not, then we're sorry. So he is just an intermediate more than anything else to the NGOs, but they do not deny the importance because he knows the people better. Next slide, please. So just the perceptions of this whole program from the government, they are providing the basis for a human life, shelter, water, and sewage. For the NGO, they are helping the government and meanwhile attaining their goals to help people. But for the beneficiaries, they are always on the receiving end. And next slide, please. This takes us to the limitations. And let me begin with the beneficiaries. As I said, they are at the receiving end and there are some biases, but the problem is there is minimal participation to what they really want. And to the extent that now they know what to ask for. If you just ask them what do you wish for, as if they're choosing from a menu, they know what the NGOs offer. They know they offer a house, a roof, or a project. So they choose one of those. They are not going to think beyond. From the NGOs, the limitation would be that there aren't any unified regulations between the several NGOs working on the program, sometimes a lack of funding and lack of giving awareness to the people. So they're so concerned with, again, physical interventions, whatever can be counted, so number of houses, number of roofs, whatever, but they them also tackling awareness is minor. And from the government, they are top-down decisions. Okay, they are top-down decisions, and there is minimal monitoring and evaluation. And unfortunately, there are lack of field workers, and this is why, from the first place, they decided to collaborate with the NGOs, because those are the ones who have the manpower. I want to highlight here that education and health are usually out of scope for NGOs. And this is due to the possible hardships, because they are large scale complex interventions. And this is only why NGOs would tackle education or health through only, again, physical intervention. So building a school or like a health center, but they don't know if there is a doctor or not. So next slide, please. We're finishing with that one. Yeah, I'll just leave you with some questions. If really the officials and the beneficiaries want the same things, which are the houses and so on, who should highlight the importance of the other factors like health and education, which were only highlighted by people who were not the intended beneficiaries? They were the people who were a little bit higher in income when it came to the village. So who should be highlighting those things? Maybe academics, or no, it's the government's role, or should the NGOs be joining? Another question I'd like to ask, like, who is responsible again for those issues, economic growth and so on? And following on what Marjit was saying, what is the role of international NGOs in such schemes? So should we be collaborating? Because usually international NGOs come with a certain program. So we're doing biogas projects, or like they have targets, but how could we do like much collaborative interventions between the local NGOs and the international NGOs? In, let's be honest, a more authoritarian country. And to end with, how does politics influence these programs? Do they really influence the source of the choice of interventions, or is it just providing the basic needs of what people want? Again, thank you so much. I hope I did it in time. Thank you for listening.
So thank you all for being interested in this topic. I am working with a co-author now. When I first submitted the paper, I can't see them, Ibrahim, but it's okay. I'll just start. I'm assuming that the first slide shows the title. It's I can see now, right now, yes. So I'm working with a co-author. When I first submitted, I was on my own, but now I have a co-author, my colleague, Ijoma. We both teach this topic to NGOs in my school, Lagos Business School, Nigeria. And our approach has been a bit more pushed by that experience of trying to teach to NGOs what is responsible leadership. And these are the questions we normally ask. What does it have to do with ethics? What does it have to do with enterprise? What does it have to do with impact? And we use that to start a conversation. And because of our experience in doing this, next slide, please, we found that it's quite clear to everybody in the NGO space that it's important to be responsible, maybe even more critical than in other spheres, so to speak, because in the NGO space, it's always expected that people are responsible and that people are there not for the money, but for social impact reasons. So we found that there's a lot of desire to do good. There's a lot of desire to make changes. But we've also found that it's very tough for an NGO leader to achieve that in our context. Next slide, please. So in our context for quite a while, we've been talking about what is called a VUCA environment, an environment where things are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I know that it's not a unique context to Nigeria, but our focus is on Nigeria for this study. So the situation is somewhat volatile because of the unsettled nature of things. Both the government policies. Sometimes they're not very stable, especially when there's a change of government. Sometimes they're not enforced because of corruption. So things are rather uncertain. It's very complex because there are many layers, ethnic differences, religious differences, all put together, all cooking, and there's unrest here and there, and it's ambiguous because sometimes you can't exactly navigate the way so clearly. And of course, it's even worse now with the COVID-19. So everybody is trying to see how to cope with the current situation. So we're teaching online. Next week, I'm teaching another group of NGOs. Now the senior management in the NGOs around. So we felt that there was a need to review what's going on with regard to leadership. We're particularly concerned, next slide please, because the impact of the NGOs in a developing country like ours is actually critical for development. We already have the experience that the governments don't manage to do everything, even with the taxpayers' money. First of all, they don't manage to collect all the tax that they could collect. But then even when they have the tax money, we don't have a lot of efficiency or effectiveness in deploying, partly because of corruption, but also sometimes partly because of competence in the people who are at the levels of governance, at the level in government. So we have reviewed literature and we found that people generally have said in their studies that in the NGO world, what's expected is transformative leadership, values-based leadership, and collaborative leadership that stand out as the approaches that would be more effective. And in our classrooms, we have found that that understanding is there, but it looks like there's still something missing, perhaps in general for NGOs, or in particular for NGOs in a developing context. So what we're trying to see, what are those ingredients that would aid a scholarship, that would aid leadership in a developing context. And we decided that rather than look at all NGOs in general, next slide please, we would focus on the NGOs that work in the environment. So why did we choose this? We chose this because in Nigeria, perhaps in other developing countries, the environment comes like maybe 4th, 5th, if not 12th place when it comes to considerations about development and sustainability. Why? Because our issues are more the social issues than the environmental. We are still fighting with trying to have peace in different pockets of the country and trying to have equity in wealth distribution and trying to have infrastructure. Power is an issue, water is an issue, internet is an issue. Witness the issues I've had this morning. Maybe it's not only here, but yeah, that's part of those are part of the issues that we have, the digital divide and the implications of that. So sometimes the environment takes a backspace. So we felt the leaders of NGOs that are focused on the environment might be a very good way to understand what's going on with trying to lead their people. So we decided to also go the way of interviews so that we can get deep insights. Next slide, please. So we have these 3 NGOs looking at, we're looking at recycling exchange. We're talking to recyclers in order to understand that recyclers, all the NGOs we're looking at are indigenous. They're working in the field of environment development, sustainability. So recyclers, they try to be the bridge between people who need to recycle and people who are in the recycling industry. And they try to bridge that up by collecting from one group of people, paying them for their garbage, and transforming it into wealth by selling to the people who can do something with it, which is something that is very much needed here, because very often it's not that people don't understand that waste can become wealth, but how exactly is it supposed to happen when there is no chain to make that happen? Next slide, please. Then we talk to EnviroNews. and news. Next slide, please. Okay, so we talked to change Adati, and the slide of Viral News has skipped, but it doesn't matter so much. So change Adati does something similar to VUCA class. Then we also talk to Viral News, which covers a wider spectrum while still focusing on the environment. So the questions we were asking them, please go on. We're trying to find out basically what are the qualities needed. Next slide, please. The qualities that these people have found most critical in this journey to try to make an impact, because they're trying to see how to carry out their work, push the development goals, the SDGs forward within a context that is particularly difficult, sometimes frustrating. And the frustration has actually come out sometimes in the interviews. Next slide, please. So specifically, these are the questions we're asking. We've been delayed to a large extent by the issue of the pandemic, trying to fix the interviews, trying to get them done. We've had many changes of schedules. I think since we're doing everything online now, it should be easier, but not necessarily. Next slide, please. So these kind of things that we're trying to find out are what's motivating them, what's kept them going, what are the challenges they have faced, what are the key traits they themselves feel are critical to responsible leadership, what are the factors that make it easier for them, and what are the things that make it more difficult for them. To what extent do they focus on the sustainable development goals, and how are they seeing the relationship between sustainability and development? Next slide, please. We also try to understand what are their own internal governance practices in the NGO, and what are their accountability structures. Those are connected, to see whether internally they're actually positioned to lead responsibly. And then we've tried to find out what they're getting from the government agencies, because we've seen from interacting with them over the years in the classroom that the government agencies have a huge impact on the extent to which the NGOs can perform responsibly. And part of the fallout of that is that we have many NGOs and we don't have as much impact as they should have. Also, we have many NGOs that work very well and then they stop functioning. We also, because of the times that we're in, decided to ask them how the COVID, the disease, the pandemic is affecting their business, because that will also give us an insight into their sustainability, how they're configured for sustainability. Then we were interested in how they measure their performance, how they see the future, and of course, very much last and perhaps the least, the demographic data to understand them better. So we haven't analyzed our results yet. We've done 4 very deep interviews. We're not yet sure whether we'll do a few more. When we go into the data more deeply for this 4, we will see whether we've reached saturation or we need to talk to more of them. And next slide, please. We have some preliminary insights from the interviews. One is that we definitely need the values-based leadership approach, because it's very difficult for NGOs. We have stories from the interviews of trying to do something, trying to achieve something good on one project or the other, and having pushbacks because of the beneficiaries not being cooperative, or sometimes the government bodies, the government parastatals, maybe one person or the other asking for a bribe, and then it affects the progress of the project. We also could see that not all impact is positive impact, especially when the impact is based on doing something that can actually harm the community because of trying to enrich some gatekeeper who is not allowing the process to flow. So sometimes they see that it looks like we could make some impact here. In the long run, this may not be good for the country or the supposed beneficiaries. And we also saw that sometimes the impact is not real from their own experiences of trying to forge ahead where other NGOs may be doing things that is not right. So it looks like there's impact, but in the end, really, the impact is not there because the what they're doing is not reaching the right beneficiaries. Say in situations where, because of having money from a donor, an NGO decides to have a fictitious project of fictitious beneficiaries. So we've learned from them how they're trying to navigate all this. And we know that they realize that doing good ultimately in the long run will give long-term sustainable benefits. And this is one of the things that is helping these NGOs that we talk to because of their own track record. We've seen they're telling us that even though they had a lot of setbacks due to the things I've mentioned, they do realize that long-term they will achieve their aim. And they do agree that responsible leadership is what will drive the governance structures so that it can authentically develop the country. So what we're saying is, with all this, one of the main things that they need to have is resilience. They need resilience quite a bit, and they need courage. So these are the two best obvious character traits that they need for responsible leadership. Courage and strength of character, because it's sometimes not easy to do intention to carry out what the mandate with integrity, and to resist when they have challenges from from government parastatals that they're supposed to work with, even though maybe it's just one person that person that's obstructing what they're trying to achieve. That one person, because of having that kind of gatekeeper status, can make it difficult for them to do what they need to do ultimately. Because if you can't pass that person, then you can't move on. Then resilience, because with so many setbacks, sometimes it's tempting to just go into other things that are not part of what the NGO is supposed to do other projects, run after every possible grant, rather than sticking to one thing that they have the expertise to do. Or sometimes there's a temptation to just go for grants that are beyond the capacity of the NGO, instead of trying to make sure that they can actually deliver on what they have. So it takes strength of character again and resilience to not to fall into that. And then the other value that is coming out that is very critical for NGO leadership is future-mindedness. Future-mindedness, to be concerned about the long-term benefits of what the NGO has set out to do, rather than just trying to have a good image in the present and to have a good reputation now that may not be based on long-term values. So future-mindedness is something that seems to have cropped up again and again in our interviews, that has helped our respondents to keep their focus on what they determined to do in the beginning. So we will continue, we'll analyze the results we have, and we hope, this is actually the last slide, but you can go on to the one that just says, thank you at the end. So we expect that we'll find out more in order to be able to actually find out what's the content of values-based leadership for an NGO leader, and what do they need? And because we're primarily educators, we're hoping to get a book chapter out of this, and we're hoping that with this book chapter, we will further inform our teaching in class and be able to help those who are in our classrooms to develop the traits that will help them to be better and more responsible leaders. Thank you very much. Next and last slide, Joseph, thank you.